this afternoon we're also going to try to talk about future issues in the field, and my section is future issues in the analysis of behavior. As you all know, we're here to celebrate as a tribute to Moscovici, and when you think about what is the life of a researcher, it's sometimes very lonely, and we try to progress and publish a few things, and sometimes we're joined by people, as luckily happened to Serge, and eventually, which only happens very few times, that flourishes, and I think we're a testimony to the flourishing of the works of Serge and of the children and the students and the books that he made and on which we are actually building now. So I'm just going to present you some possible developments just from one small piece of what has been done by Moscovici, and I'm more of the social representation branch of his legacy. And so I'm going to talk to you about one side of social representations that has been a little bit underrepresented in the research so far, which is action, right? As Moscow said, social representations define the stimuli which surround and provoke us and which responses to give. And these responses are not just discourse, but they're also action. And Abrick, who is also sorely missing, say that the study of representation must address the two major forms of actuation, but that's discourse and action. And because it's easier to look at discourse, most of us have actually been looking at discourse, and except for a few. And Denise is always cited for one small part of her huge work on what? Oh, that's on the boat at the last conference in Marseille. Yes, right, a month ago. Okay, and she showed that practice was actually a very good way to access representations in the way caretakers would handle, manier their pensioners who were mentally ill. Wolfgang Wagner, who is not here today, showed that we tend usually to interpret, to study representations by thinking that representation explain behavior, but he said, you know, this is not necessarily the way it goes. You could just go the other way around, and he takes 3 examples, and in a way we should perhaps see representation and action as indissociable in some kind of interpretive loop with which we interpret the environment. I'm talking here about individual representation because usually action is at the individual level, but then we have to think of it at a more social level. And this, of course, resonates with the work of Uexküll about this perception-action loop, and so in a way representations would be on the sort of embodied side of this loop. But the important thing that was brought to us by Moscovici is that in the relation between the subject and the environment, we should not just look at the subject and the environment as the perception-action loop, but also consider the other, who is very important, and that there is no such thing for us humans as relation with the environment in abstracto of the other. I remember Serge would say, où est l'autre? When you study something, first question to ask, où est l'autre? Okay. Yeah, 1984 was actually the year I started with Moscovici my thesis. Can you imagine? It lasted 11 years. We couldn't do this nowadays, right? Anyway, so this issue of what are the social side of action, social practices, whatever we call them. Is there some kind of motor aspect of common sense, the things that we're expected to do, that we are expected to be shared, like the fact that we all come here in this conference and we're expected when we're attending just to sit and take notes quietly, and when you're here to speak, or these are actions. These are not just thoughts, right? So perhaps we should think about shared interpretive systems that combine representation and action in one single thing. This idea has been present since the beginning. I mean, you would find it in most of the authors on social representations, but actually this is the talk, but we don't necessarily walk the talk, right? It's because we say it's there, just like The Economist or Smith would say it's very important to consider everything, and then we focus on what's easy, that's under the lamp post, so to say. Right. But then this will bring us to a lot of questions about what are the relations of the concept that we're using with other people in other disciplines. What about habitus? What about scripts, reenactment, perceptual symbol systems, etc., which are things that are not so much in the scope of our literature reviews. And one huge question, which is what actually stopped us, is what empirical techniques to study action? Why have so few people gone in the direction of serious, solid ethnography? Well, when you read Denise's book, I mean, you understand why. I mean, this is a hell of a work, right? And on top of that, it's very difficult to publish in a 5,000 or 10,000 words paper. Just because as you start just describing the context of your research, you're already 50,000 words, okay? So nobody wants to take this. All right. So fortunately, it seems that we now, technology is coming to help us, and we have new techniques that enable to access what people do and access what people think as they do. So I've been using these small cameras, for example, that are worn on a pair of glasses. You see them here. This is the last version from 2014. We 3D print them, so people wear them as they act, and then we get films like this. This was filmed actually by a barman about 5 minutes walk from here. I hope we get some sound.
Bonsoir.
Je pourrais vous mettre à changer 10 minutes?
Ouais, ça marche. J'arrive, 2 secondes. Franck, à la 32, 2 coupes de champagne et un café.
Okay. We see what's action from a first-person perspective, right? But the interesting thing of that is not just that we can actually look in detail at what happens in the real settings, I mean, outside of the lab. But the thing is that we are now able to access what people think as they do it, because when we show them the tapes, they are taken back in the perception action loop and they access their episodic memory, as Tolving would say. Which means that this, you mentioned Wundt. Why did psychology abandon this way? Because we thought that introspection was impossible, okay? Now, this is the kind of thing that we get when we show the participants their tapes afterwards. So this is a doctor who was trying to do a difficult intubation, then the patient is, the throat is blocked and she can't do it. So you don't have to look at the details, but what happens is that, much after what happened, this person is able to remember exactly, the saturation level and the cardiac rhythm that the patient had at that moment. And this varied a lot during the whole session, and this is the exact values, okay? So when people are put back into the situation, they are able to tell us what they actually thought at that moment. And we're able to check that it is true because we just have to pause the video and ask, okay, what are you going to do next? And then we see what they tell us, and we can check immediately by replaying whether it was accurate or not. So we now have these capacities to know what people think as they do and to see exactly what they do, not to rely on what they're doing. So my team and I have been using this technique for about 18 years now, and what comes out from that is we're able to peel what they do second by second and see what are the various determinants of their action. And it turns out that the determinants are embodied interpretive systems, including representations, of course, right? but also pretty much material affordances, to use Gibson's terms, like what's actually possible physically that influences what they're doing, which is common sense. And of course, social regulation, could be that feedback of the others or social influence in various formats, rules, etc. Okay? So this is what we get, but this raises a whole lot of questions, and this is why I think this is some of the future things that we have to evaluate. There's lots of things to analyze, and suddenly a lot of things that are not currently in our scope, okay, like affordances, episodes, reenactment, embodiment, actants, multitasking, paradigmatic learning, all these things have to come, right? Because we're studying something new. It is not just discourse. This is action. This is a different realm, okay? Right. And the feeling that we have is that for many actions, people's behavior seems to be constrained. This is exactly the opposite of the quote of Moscovici, page 121 that Juliet showed us. I think the society is, for many things, seems pretty much a machine to force us into rather standard behaviors, just like all you guys are sitting in a standard behavior right now, even though it's, you know, free will, but still it looks pretty much like the behavior is similar, okay? And a lot of our life is just following these tracks that society gives us, okay, from cradle to grave. If you think, if you've taken the plane recently, just think how much individual decision you've taken from the moment you checked in at the counter to the moment you came out of the other airport on the other end, right? Most of the time you were just channeled by technical or mental or social systems. This doesn't mean you don't have free will. It means that there's a minimum of coherence that makes us have similar behaviors, just like we have similar representations. And it's just not just by copycat. It's much more complex than that. You know, the whole setting, the whole culture is involved into the reproduction of these things. Lots of work to do for us as a community. The kind of thing that we get is that we realize that we can study in great detail the behaviors. This is, for example, behaviors of people coming home, and we're trying to see what it means to be home. And we realize that most of us do have the same kind of sequence. For example, we take the key out of our pocket even before, long before we get to the door, then we get in, and there is some sort of like, when you pass the door. And perhaps you have it in your entry corridor, this place where you put all the keys and all the stuff. Does that mean anything to you guys? No? Where you empty your pockets? We'll have this, okay? Et cetera, right? Very close to the script notion of Schenck and Abelson, but there would be a long discussion on this, on paradigmatic learning, and okay. All right. So another example is that how thought processes are connected to the place and the environment. This is work by one of my students in the intensive care units, and we studied the decision-making processes of the pairs of doctor and nurse, and it turns out that depending on the places, they don't have the same cognitive processes, and some places favor more decision-making processes, for example, when you're at the head of the patient because you've got more information concentrated there, etc. I won't get into the detail. My point here was more about what we can take from Moscovici's legacy, right? And so this first thing is, let us study the behavioral side of these, what we call social representations, right? And also, I was reflecting on this model, which just says basically, how are people constrained into these standard behaviors? They have to do something that is compatible with the material affordances. You can do only what is allowed by the current context. You came here, you sat on the chairs, not on the floor, okay? Embodied interpretive systems, you all have the representation of what a conference is, so you acted according to this, and the social regulation, I've been part of that by reminding you of the time, and also all the planning and the rules, and so basically we do what is allowed at the intersection of these three things. And some of you are familiar with my installation theory that says that, okay, society frames these things, so this is how we manage that people behave correctly. But then, this is about the legacy of Serge, and if you look a little bit more at this model, and take off, you know, whatever, and this looks like something you've, okay? Yeah, that was just my point. We're dwarfs seated on the shoulders of giants. Thank you.